Good evening. It's April 10th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I will be the host of tonight's regular Friday evening webcast here at LaRouchepack.com. We have a special broadcast tonight, which will feature an in-depth presentation by Benjamin Deniston, who many of you are familiar with, a leader of our LaRouche Pack scientific basement team, who will be following up on and developing much of the subject matter that he presented on this forum here last week. Our subject for tonight is the urgent solution that is necessary to address the crisis in water supply and the crisis more generally threatening the lives of our people here in the United States, and the task of creating a new presidency, which will be qualified for that purpose, as Mr. LaRouche indicated very clearly in an initiative that he launched during a discussion with the LaRouche Pack Policy Committee on Monday of this past week. Now, very briefly, before we get to that, and before I give the podium to Ben Deniston here, we have one urgent matter which needs to be addressed in brief, which is the subject of a press release that was released today, published on this website earlier today. The title of that press release is Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche warn the despicable attack or the despicable attempt to frame Dr. Natalia Vitrenko of Ukraine stinks of Nazism in the Bandera tradition, Victoria Nuland's favorite ideology. Very briefly, this press release begins by stating the following, quote, American statesman Lyndon LaRouche and his wife, Schiller Institute founder Helga LaRouche, forcefully denounced today a Nazi-led campaign being carried out by the Security Services of Ukraine, the SBU, to defame and threaten the prominent Ukrainian economist and former Member of Parliament, Dr. Natalia Vitrenko, a heroine and leading intellectual leader of that country. There has to be a high suspicion that this is being orchestrated by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, said Lyndon LaRouche, or by someone else with an affinity for Nazis in the Bandera tradition, such as Nuland is notorious for, unquote. Helga LaRouche responded to the news of the escalated attacks on the Ukrainian economist and politician by saying the following, quote, these slanders are all the more despicable in that they occur 1 month before the 70th anniversary of the defeat of Nazism in Europe in May of 1945. The nation said after the end of that war, never again. But the Western governments have forgotten about that pledge. Natalia Vitrenko has had the integrity to expose the neo-Nazi revival and to give evidence of Banderite atrocities both historically and in our day, while Victoria Nuland's chosen Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, on the contrary, had the nerve to say on German television that the Nazi invasion never occurred, that it was only the Soviet Union that occupied Ukraine, unquote. Mrs. LaRouche also noted that Vitrenko has spoken frequently in Europe on both the harm done to Ukraine's economy by IMF and free trade policies, and the threat of the revival of fascist ideology in Ukraine, encouraged from the West. Quote, Dr. Vitrenko is well known and highly respected in Europe, said LaRouche. And she has had high-level meetings both there and in earlier years in the United States. It is important for political figures worldwide to condemn these ludicrous attacks on Natalia Vitrenko and identify where they are coming from, unquote. So I'm going to stop there, but the text of this press release in full, as I said, is available on the LaRouche Pack website, along with further supplemental background material concerning the facts of this case. As you just heard, Mrs. LaRouche thought it was urgent that this be brought to the immediate attention of the American people and that this be firmly and unequivocally condemned. And I think that this only underscores the nature of the present period that we find ourselves in and the urgent and profound responsibility that is placed on our shoulders at this time, with the task of providing the leadership needed to clean up and clean out the 16 years of the mess of the Bush and Obama presidencies and to create a new presidency, a new presidential team here in the United States, which, as you will hear tonight, is a task upon which the lives of the American people depend, not to mention those of the rest of the population of this planet. So that said, we're going to move into the feature presentation of our webcast here tonight, which will be a presentation by Benjamin Deniston. So I'd like to hand the podium over to Ben.
Thanks, Matthew. As we discussed last week, as we presented on the LaRouche PAC site, the LaRouche Political Action Committee, under Mr. LaRouche's direction, has launched a campaign addressing this water crisis in California and the West, southwestern United States more generally. The reality is, which we're going to get into here, the water exists. The water needed by California, by the other states of the Southwest, exists. The water needed in other parts of the world exists. There's not a shortage of water on this planet. Mankind needs to move into new levels of managing the global water system as a whole, which is something Mr. LaRouche was referring to earlier today. That's where we have to move to. There's nothing stopping mankind from going to that level other than the degeneration represented by Jerry Brown, for example, the current governor of California, and people like him. We have the solutions. They need to be developed. We need to create a new presidency that can develop these solutions. But to do that, we have to take out the trash. And, I think that starts with Jerry Brown. Now, I think this is a very interesting case study, actually, in everything that's gone wrong in the United States. How our nation has been brought to this point where California is now drying and dying while the governor sits there and does nothing. Take Jerry Brown. This is a case you could call profiles in degeneration. It's ironic. It expresses what's happened to this country when you look at the fact that Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown, as governor in the 60s, built some of the largest water projects in the state. His California State Water Project created the means to support 23 million people, to support new agriculture, to support new industry. Much of the growth of California and the prosperity of California, the people, the families, the farms, the industries, were created by his actions, by his forcing through these water projects in the tradition of Roosevelt, Kennedy, of that generation of development. That created a whole potential in California which now exists because of the actions of Pat Brown and people like him, people like Kennedy, people like Franklin Roosevelt. These are the actions that created our nation, that created the livelihood of entire families, of entire cities, of entire agricultural regions. And then you have Jerry Brown, who typifies the degeneration which has occurred over the past 2 generations, the past 50 years. California is facing the death of large sections of the state. And Jerry Brown, the son of this person that created the potential for much of this state to exist, his son Jerry Brown sits there and says, well, get used to it. It's how it is. Discussing the situation in California, he says, well, the natural carrying capacity of the state is really more like 300 or 400,000 people. Now we have 38 million people. So is that his policy, to lower the California's population by 90%? That's his response. He's done nothing to talk about bringing new water to the state. He's done nothing to talk about actually addressing the crisis. He's only imposing mandatory cuts and telling people, get used to it. It's not going to be there. You're going to suffer and die and deal with it. Although he's only telling that to the general population. The people that are doing fracking, they're not getting cuts. They're not subject to the mandatory restrictions. So obviously he's talking to certain people when he says get used to it. The people doing the fracking, pumping water in the ground to release this gas and oil, he's not talking to them. They don't have to get used to it. He'll take care of them, apparently. But when it comes to the families and the farms of the state, get used to it. This is how it's going to be. So this typifies the degeneration, the destruction of our nation. And this guy has it's utter idiocy. It's not even close to competence. It's somewhat amazing to see the statements coming out of the governor of the largest state in the nation in terms of economic activity and population. This guy is standing up there as the governor, representing this state, California, in the midst of an utter crisis, major drought ravaging the state, and he says, it's a new world. We're living in a new world now. Did he not know California is a desert? Did he not know the majority of people in California live in a desert? Did he not get the memo? Has he not done his homework on what state he's governing? This is not a surprise. This is not a new world. This is something people have been talking about for decades. LaRouche has been talking about this for decades. You want California to exist? You want the West to exist? You got to bring in more water. He's been saying that since the 70s and 80s and campaigning on it. We've been campaigning on it. So the idea that this is some new world, some surprise that California is getting drier is beyond ridiculous. This is why NWAPA was designed in the 50s and 60s. The North American Water and Power Alliance, this grand vision to better distribute the unequal distribution of precipitation in the state. You have immense excess precipitation in the north, Alaska, northern Canada, on the western region, and a utter lack of very little precipitation in the southwest. It was already known in the 50s and 60s, even after Roosevelt's projects, even after the great water projects developing the Colorado River and beginning to develop the San Joaquin, the Sacramento River, to develop these western river basins. It was still known that that was not going to be enough water to support California or this whole region. So they designed NWAPA because they knew the survival and the growth of this region depended upon bringing in a stable, regular, abundant supply of water. So the idea that this is a new world, a surprise, something unexpected is utterly ridiculous. It's incompetence that is somewhat amazing to be uttered from a governor. The governor of the largest economic state, largest populated state in the entire nation. So the incompetence and degeneration coming out of the governorship in California is criminal at this point. And LaRouche has said in no uncertain terms, this guy's just got to go. We can't tolerate this. You're talking about people's lives. You're talking about the lives of the people in California. You're talking about the agricultural section of California, which much of the nation depends upon. That's one of our most productive agricultural regions of the entire country. So this guy to just sit back and say, let this state die off, and then when pressed say, oh, well, the state only is supposed to have 500,000 people anyway, so, we're overpopulated. This is criminal degeneration, and this guy's he's got to go. He's got to get out of there. And quite frankly, what we're learning now is the situation is actually even worse than what was recognized in the time when NWAPA was designed in the 50s and 60s. That what we're learning now is that the climate in California is actually historically significantly drier than we've even experienced in the recent period. That by recent studies of the historical records of climate in California, in the West, in the Southwest, we're now realizing that the amount of water, the amount of precipitation, the amount of river flow, snowpack, etc., in California over the past century, the past 150 years or so, has actually been somewhat above average. If you look at a longer scale of, say, a couple thousand years, maybe 7,000 years, as some studies have looked at, that the more recent period has actually been, on average, wetter and more stable. And we've known it's a desert region, but we're now learning that it actually fluctuates a lot more by natural conditions, and it tends to average drier. So, in one sense, people have to let this reality sink in. In one sense, it might not even be really accurate to call this a drought. This might be more of an exit of a temporary wet period, back to something that's more normal relative to the natural conditions, before mankind moves in and improves them. So these are the realities we're talking about. And so with these realities on the table, for somebody like Brown to come in and say, this is just how it's going to be and get used to it, this is criminal. And he takes it farther. He then has the gall to come up and say, well, this is evidence of man-made climate change. You're saying that a drought in the desert is evidence of man-made climate change? We're now getting records showing that the past century has been wetter than the average, and you're seeing a reversal of that process, and you're attributing this to man's activity? I mean, this is ridiculous. This is utter insanity. So this guy when he says we're in a new world, I don't know what world he was living in when he was saying we've entered a new world, but it wasn't reality. It wasn't what we've been talking about. It wasn't the facts and the reality of the situation that we've known and been talking about on the LaRouche PAC site, that LaRouche has been talking about, that other qualified experts have been talking about, the people that built NWAPA or designed NWAPA. That's what they were talking about. This is not a new world. This is Jerry Brown's, whatever domain he has been living in. This is that being rattled, perhaps. Maybe that's what he's referring to. But this is not a surprise. This is not unexpected. And this is not something that has no solutions. We can deliver the water for California for the West. It's going to take some work, some serious work. It's going to take a real mission. As Mr. LaRouche is emphasizing, it's going to take a new presidential administration centered around the necessary competence and capability to address this. But meeting those requirements, the solutions do exist. We have the potential to begin to address these things. But the first step is getting rid of Brown, getting rid of Obama. I mean, Obama, too, last year, the President of the United States, right, comes to California last year, and again says, oh, this is evidence of man-made climate change, and then does nothing to help the state. And then even the New York Times, which itself is on record as a major supporter of this crazy idea that mankind is causing some catastrophic destruction of the planet by driving our cars. Even the New York Times, which supports this general thesis, which itself is ridiculous at this point, because there's been no warming for 18 years, more than 18 years. But, even the New York Times, it supports this whole man-made climate change catastrophe narrative. Even they had to come out and say, well, actually, a lot of the models show that if there was actually warming, California would get wetter, not drier. And that was their direct response to Obama last year. So even in the crazy world of the climate change catastrophe community, even they had to come out and call out the President of the United States for making such an incompetent, baseless statement. So you got Obama saying that last year. Brown is saying that this year. Now the state's even worse conditions than it was last year. What is Obama's response? Now he's getting back on the climate change issue saying, oh, it's going to cause more asthma. California is drying out and dying, and this nut job is talking about some fantastical global warming that's not even happening. Hasn't been happening for over 18 years. And he's talking about the hypothetical increase of asthma rates. Well, California is dying. I mean, this Jerry Brown, Obama, these people have to go if California is going to survive, if the West is going to survive at this point. So that's step one, take out the trash, get rid of these guys. And if we have a sane administration, a human administration that's willing to do what we used to do what Pat Brown did before the degeneration of his son, to do what John F. Kennedy did and tried to do what Franklin Roosevelt did, to actually create real economic growth, to invest in developing the future. If we have that idea again, what's being represented by the BRICS, what China is doing right now, what the alliance between China and the other BRICS nations are actually doing right now, creating a new platform for their nations, developing their territory, developing their population, improving their conditions of life. We're sitting here, the West is drying out, California's dying. In nearly a decade, China has created, just a little more than a decade, two of the largest water transfer projects that mankind has ever built. 10, 15 years, these things have been constructed. They're actually larger in scale than the accumulation of everything that was done in the Southwest from the time of Franklin Roosevelt to the time of John F. Kennedy. That 60-year span, 30-year span, 30, 40-year span, the early 30s up to the late 60s. In that whole time period, when we had this growth orientation, everything that was built over that period in terms of water transfer, the development of the Colorado, Sacramento, San Joaquin, and related river systems in the West, everything that was done there has been surpassed in less than half the time by China's Southwater North project. They've created man-made rivers nearly of the size of the Colorado River, bringing water up to the north. So these things, mankind can do these things. We can pursue these projects. We can solve these water issues. There's nothing holding us back other than this degeneration, this brown degeneration. So we have the potential options. We have the conceptions, the framework, which we can begin to utilize to solve the situation in the West and the Southwest. But it requires that we be human again, that we have a commitment again to creating a better future for the next generation, for real growth, real development. That cultural decay of that going away has to be reversed. And that can create the potential in which we can pursue the options. And the options are going to be difficult. They are now going to be major challenges. Because of the past 2 generations of decay, we're in a far worse situation than we should have been in. Because Lyndon LaRouche was not listened to, because NWAPA was not built, the West is now in a more difficult situation, and it's going to require a larger investment, a greater action, a greater leap in terms of our management of water. And this takes us to the Pacific Ocean as a whole. And this is something that we were talking with Mr. LaRouche about earlier today. And we can see this in the first graphic, which can be displayed on the screen there. This is the solution to the Western water crisis, is a better understanding of the water system of the West as a whole. We have to begin to think about managing the relationship between the Pacific Ocean and North America. We have to think about a new conception of mankind's relationship to this water system as a whole. This means an array of options, developing the water potentials being provided by the Pacific to improve the entire territory of the western regions of the continent, even stretching further inland. But this is what mankind does. This is what makes mankind human. You could even map mankind's development by his historical improvement of his management of water systems. You could take the history of mankind and look at the improvement of larger scale systems of river systems, streams and canals, irrigation systems, moving to larger and larger scales. The history of mankind has always been characterized by our continual improvements of larger and larger water systems, and today, right now, the challenge is to go to a qualitatively higher level. So let's look at what we're talking about when we're talking about water in the West. The water is not just some store of water we're using up somewhere. I mean, some people literally talk about it like that. It's insane. There's not some finite amount of water somewhere that we're just pulling out and going to use up, and then we need to slow down our use, restrict our use for these insane reasons. The entire world is characterized by a water cycle, a cyclical system of the motion of water between different systems. What mankind can do uniquely is improve those cycles. We can manage them. We can make them more productive. We can ensure that more productive activity, more growth, is produced by this water system. And if we're talking about the West, the source is the Pacific Ocean. You have the evaporation of immense amount of fresh water off of the Pacific Ocean. In global terms, the global average is that 10 times more water evaporates up off of the oceans than all the water flowing out of every single river on every single continent on the planet. If you take every single river flowing out into the ocean on every single continent added up, it's less than 1/10 of the amount of water constantly flowing up into the atmosphere. Fresh water being produced by the evaporative activity of the sun evaporating ocean water, removing the salt, leaving the salt behind, producing nice fresh water. That's the source of all water we have on land, as far as we currently understand. Now, the vast majority of that evaporation never even makes it on land. It just falls into the ocean, precipitates into the ocean. On average, globally, around 90% of the water evaporated by solar activity from the ocean just falls back into the ocean again without ever making it on land. If we're talking about this region of Western North America, this water has a characteristic of moving, this water vapor, this evaporated water coming up off the ocean, has this characteristic of flowing from the east to the west, supplying the fresh water component of the entire western region of the continent. Now, it just so happens that the natural cycle of that is rather inefficient. It's rather unproductive. Under the natural conditions of this Pacific North American interaction, the vast majority of that water gets deposited in the Northwest. And much of that gets deposited on the coastal line, the coastal region of the Northwest, and flows back into the ocean rather quickly. Something on the range of 10 times more water is deposited into the Northwest versus into the Southwest. So you have this huge discrepancy. And the water that's in the Northwest, much of it flows back out into the ocean rather quickly. So this was the basis of the NWAPA design. Why not take a small fraction of that cycle? It's not stealing water that's, some finite supply you're taking away. Why not divert a small percentage, 5, 10, 15% of the river runoff running off into the ocean from this northwestern region? Divert it down into the Southwest, put it to work. Water is more productive in the Southwest. The amount of life supported per unit amount of water in the Southwest is much higher. The amount of human economic activity, the amount of photosynthetic activity, the amount of productive activity of the water cycle is actually significantly higher in the Southwest than the Northwest. Much of this being attributed, it's obviously a lot colder in the Northwest. There's other less populated, other conditions, but also a lot of this water just falls very, very quickly back, flows back into the ocean again. So why not divert some of that water down into the Southwest, increase the productivity of that water, increase the time it spends on land, and then let it run back into the ocean again after it does productive work, after it supports more life, more plant life, more forests, more crops, more human economic activity. And then let it return to the ocean again. It's a cycle. Manage the cycle. Increase the productivity of the North American water cycle as a whole. That's what NWAPA was talking about. And if people were really supportive of green, they would have gone with this policy. The Colorado River could be flowing into the ocean again the way it used to. The Rio Grande could be flowing back into the ocean again the way it used to. Owens Valley in California could become a agricultural region again. We could have developed this whole region. So that's characteristic of this particular system we're dealing with in the West. And we have had the designs to increase the productivity of that cycle, that system as a whole, with this NWAPA conception, because you're dealing with these particular characteristics. And this is what mankind can do to actually increase the value, the usefulness of water in this entire Western region. But again, this wasn't done, and we need to look to larger solutions, higher order solutions as part of our approach to the crisis now, because of the situation that's built up, because of the failure to develop NWAPA, the failure to manage and improve the water cycle the way we should have and could have over the past 2 generations. And what this requires, which is what we've been working on in the basement under Mr. LaRouche's direction, is let's upgrade our conception of how mankind relates to this water cycle. If you're talking about managing the Colorado River or NWAPA or managing a local river, that's all still kind of the same category of relationship to the water cycle as a whole. You're talking about a 2-dimensional planar interaction with the cycle. You're saying we're going to look for where the water precipitates, where it falls onto land. And then we're going to, utilize that to the best of our ability, move it around, transfer it, make sure it does a lot of work while it's here, before it returns back into the ocean and closes its cycle. You can do that on smaller scales, larger scales. NWAPA is a larger scale. That's what California has depended upon for the past, better part of this last century with their water management projects. But now we're learning that these natural climate systems are not actually stable and fixed. We can't necessarily just rely on the precipitation patterns that exist. And apparently this is a surprise to Jerry Brown, Obama, and other people that the climate apparently changes. Apparently this is a big surprise to people, that the climate changes. I guess they didn't know this. I guess this is news to them. And the only thing they can think of apparently is that, well, it must be mankind, because anything that changes we have to attribute to mankind, and it must be bad somehow. So these systems, we're limiting our potential by just remaining on this 2-dimensional relationship to the water cycle, just relying on the surface water, the precipitation patterns that exist. So we need to change mankind. We need to go to higher levels. The cycle is not just the water that falls on land. It comes from the ocean. It fills the atmosphere. There's incredible amounts of water in the ocean. You can picture Jerry Brown standing there on a California beach with his back to the ocean, addressing the state saying, we're out of water. There's nothing we can do. Meanwhile, you can't even see the end of the Pacific. It curves around the entire planet. The water is there. It's how we choose to manage it and develop it. Why not go with large-scale desalination? We have the technology to purify ocean water, turn it into fresh water, and bring it inland. It's being done. It's attempting to be done in California on very small scales. It's done on slightly larger scales in other places around the world, but still on a relatively small scale overall. There's no reason why we can't draw with especially the fusion driver program, increasing the energy flux density of the economy as a whole, increasing the power available per capita and per square kilometer of the economic territory as a unity. We could have much larger scale desalination. We can be effectively creating our own water cycles. You know, superseding the role of the sun. We're saying we're not going to just be dependent upon what water gets evaporated by the sun and dependent upon where it lands. We're saying we'll just cut that out. We'll just go right to the source. We'll produce it ourselves, and we'll create an entire new cycle. And we'll support life with it. We'll support growth with it. We'll develop with it. With a nuclear driver program, a fusion driver program, we can do that. You know, 65% of the population in California exists in just 3 of the major greater metropolitan areas: the Bay Area, the greater San Diego area, and the Los Angeles area. Those are all major coastal regions. That's well over half of the population of the entire state. Why not provide all their water with desalination? That would be a much more significant contribution to increasing water availability than this crazy cut that Jerry Brown is talking about. So these types of solutions exist. They can be developed. We can create a crash program for mass-scale desalination. And again, this is changing how mankind interacts with the water cycle. We're saying we're not just dependent upon where the rain falls. You know, we'll utilize that where it exists, but we'll kind of supersede the role of the sun and create our own cycles, create our own freshwater systems under man's control, man's direction. That's one aspect. That's an immediate aspect that absolutely needs to be pursued to secure the livelihood of California and other western regions, especially other coastal regions. But we can go farther, and this is another thing that we are in the process of studying and pursuing. But there's no reason why mankind can't begin to tap the moisture systems in the atmosphere itself. You know, and this is something that's already being done. There's already operations ongoing that have demonstrated multiple times in different locations, under different conditions, even with different technologies, that by ionization systems, we can actually begin to ourselves stimulate the condensation of atmospheric moisture and increase precipitation, increase rainfall. Potentially even create new drafts of moisture from over the ocean, pulling it inland. Increasing the amount of evaporated water from the ocean that makes it over land and precipitates over land. These are systems that have been demonstrated in Mexico, in Israel. They've been demonstrated in Australia, on the Arabian Peninsula, in Oman, in the United Arab Emirates. These are technologies that were developed in Russia, you know, over a couple decades ago and have been utilized there. You know, the potential exists that we could actually begin to tap into certain ionization, electrical conditions in the atmosphere and manage those to actually begin to manage weather patterns to some degree. How far we can pursue this, we need to figure that out. There should be a crash program on developing these ionization-based weather modification systems. And we can be increasing the draft of moist air from over the oceans that comes over land. And again, you know, what are the scales we're talking about? 10 times more, 90% of the water that evaporates from the oceans never even makes it over land. 10 times more water is available flowing up into the atmosphere than what flows out of every major river. This is a huge resource. There's no reason why we should have a crash program to develop these ionization technologies, pursue related technologies that can begin to give us some kind of handle, some kind of control on these flows of atmospheric moisture and controlling when it condenses, when it precipitates, when it comes over land as rainfall or snow or other forms of precipitation. These are technologies that exist that should be pursued rapidly. And this takes us to an interesting perspective, which is a greater realization of how the water cycle even functions, what the water cycle even is. Because what we're now beginning to understand and beginning to get greater insights into is that these type of ionization conditions and electrical and related effects on the atmosphere are actually the product of nothing on Earth, nothing even in the solar system, but the activity of the galaxy. The major source of this ionization effect, which has a relationship to how water behaves in the atmosphere and affects climate and affects cloud formation and affects precipitation and rainfall. The major input into this ionization quality of the atmosphere is galactic activity. And there's records of the climate on Earth varying and changing in correspondence with the changing relationship of our solar system with the galactic system. Also, changes in solar activity. As the sun changes and fluctuates, we see corresponding effects in the climate, the precipitation, the weather patterns here on Earth. So now what are we talking about? Now this is a completely new perspective. We have to realize that this water cycle, this precipitation, the climate system that we live in, that we depend upon, is not even an Earth-based system. It's not even a solar system-based system. It's not even just the activity of the sun, which contributes to defining the characteristics of this global water cycle that we depend upon and that our future depends upon increasing our management of. That we're actually living in effect in a cosmic environment, in a galactic environment, the environment that we, talk about environmentalists, right? Real environmentalists will recognize that their environment is part of the galactic system. That's your environment. If you're concerned about your environment, start talking about the galaxy. This is the conditions that we live in. These are the effects that control and influence the water cycle, the flows of atmospheric moisture, the development of climate, weather patterns, etc. Now, this gives us a completely new perspective on what we're dealing with, and we have to understand it from this standpoint. We have to understand the global climate system, the water cycle, the water system, as a product of these cosmic effects. And that insight can give us what's needed to begin to pursue even greater control over these atmospheric systems. Again, what I just referenced, this is being done on small scales with definite success, but not necessarily the size of success that we'll need with these ionization systems being done in a number of nations around the world. That we've demonstrated we can tap into and modulate these types of effects that are similar to and related to these cosmic effects. But we have to make a breakthrough in understanding this whole process to see how far we can take this, to allow us to begin to manage these atmospheric moisture systems and improve them and utilize them and bring new water cycles on land. Ensure that the current precipitation patterns are steady, are regular. That when the climate changes, as the climate naturally does, to the surprise of Jerry Brown and other fools, that when it begins to change, we can ensure that mankind has some input to make sure it doesn't actually change. That we get a regular, steady flow of the water where we need it. And where there's not enough in the natural cycle, we can induce more. So these are the levels that we have to go to solve the current crisis. We have to come to a higher understanding of what the water cycle even is, how the climate system even works, and utilize that understanding to change our relationship to the system to allow us to improve our ability to manage and control and utilize that system to ensure it's more productive, it's more useful work gets done. So this is an array of approaches that we need to pursue as a unified effect. And this is what Mr. LaRouche was saying earlier today in some discussions with him. He said, start with the Pacific North American relationship. That characterizes what you're dealing with. That's the source of water for the West, for the entire western, much of the region of the continent. So we have to manage that as a whole system. You have the natural variation, you have the natural tendency to have much more of the water precipitate, deposit itself in the Northwest. So we should be thinking about how to bring some of that down into the Southwest, something along the lines of Nawapa. Ensure the water that does get deposited gets distributed and utilized and put to good work. You know, this water spent a lot of time in the ocean, sitting there waiting to do something. You know, only a very tiny select percent of the water gets the chance to take that trip into the atmosphere. You know, take the skyline travel, you know, and get the chance to maybe, you know, 1 out of 10 of them gets to land on land, right? You know, only 10% of the water evaporated from the oceans actually makes it on land. So even that's a select few. So 1 out of 10 of a tiny percentage. And then that poor little water molecule waiting all this time to go on this ride and get some work done, you know, lands on the Alaskan coast and then just runs right back into the ocean again, you know? Let's have some concern for this water molecule, right? Let's ensure that these systems actually do something useful. So Nawapa as a concept is something we need to be pursuing, but from this standpoint, in conjunction with recognizing that's one aspect, that's a two-dimensional aspect of a multidimensional process that we need to understand as a whole and manage as a whole. So the water that's deposited, precipitated, we're going to get the most work out of it as possible. Make sure it produces the most plant life, the most photosynthetic activity, the most crops, supports human economic activity, most importantly. Ensure that that water cycle, the natural water cycle that exists, does something useful. But then go beyond that, you know, in the coastal regions especially, to start creating our own freshwater inputs. You know, pursue nuclear power, increase the energy flux density of the economy, give mankind the depth, the capability to begin creating our own rivers. You know, we're doing it on a tiny scale now, but the technology exists. And in the context of a fusion driver program, we can be doing this on a much larger scale. The planetary system, the biospheric system itself, can be much more productive, get much more done under mankind's management, this type of activity. So that's another aspect how we can manage this Pacific continental interaction. But then again, we need a crash program to pursue this atmospheric aspect. We have to begin to understand how these cosmic inputs work and utilize that understanding to provide us with a new capability, a new power to influence them, to direct the moisture where it's needed, to keep it from where it's not needed, to ensure that it falls in regions where it's needed and not regions where it's not needed. You know, under mankind's management, the entire system can be rapidly much more productive than it currently is. So those are the boundary conditions defining the absolutely necessary solution to the current water crisis in the West. And again, this is not just an objective problem. We have many of these technologies. We have the means to pursue and better understand many aspects of these technologies. What we need to start with is eliminating the degeneration, eliminating Jerry Brown. Get him out of there. He doesn't belong in a city council, much less the governorship of a large state. And we need a government that recognizes that this is mankind's activity. This is the only thing that makes us unique and gives us meaning as a species. We're not defined by any level of technology. Mankind is not defined by any particular cultural stage or economic stage or level of technological development. It's not like this set of tools is what makes us human. It's always the ability to create new tools, to create new stages, to create new economic platforms. If we ever reject that, which we have done over the past 2 generations, which Brown typifies, we condemn ourselves to death, as California has been condemned to death under the current policy, being then pursued and imposed by Brown. So we have to be human. We have to pursue the creation of completely new solutions, moving to completely new levels to create a new stage of mankind. And it's only when we're doing that and creating the conditions where the next generation can go farther, it's only when we engage in that kind of activity that we can have a healthy economy, that we can pursue our true nature as a unique creative species on this planet. And as we've discussed on these broadcasts, we have the potential to do that globally. That is happening. That's what China is doing. That's what the BRICS nations are doing. You know, China's space program is taking mankind to a completely new perspective on our relationship to the solar system as a whole. You know, it implicitly takes us to this perspective on redefining and reconceptualizing the water cycle as a cosmic process, not an Earth-based process. That's where we have to take mankind. That's the next stage. We're not an Earth-based species. We're not an animal species. This water crisis is a crisis of our failure to recognize that if we don't reach for the stars, reach for the galaxy, understand these higher processes, and utilize our understanding to improve the conditions on the planet in a way that only mankind can. If we don't do that, we will destroy ourselves. And California is being destroyed right now. This has been 2, not generations, but 2 degenerations, typified by Pat Brown to Jerry Brown. So what we need today is to not just reverse that, but to leapfrog, to go to this higher level. And that's what Mr. LaRouche has defined with the challenge of needing to create a new presidency in the United States that will commit itself to not just solving some practical aspects of the water crisis in California, but will commit itself to developing and pursuing and implementing a new conception of mankind as a cosmic-based creative force in conjunction with other nations. And we're at the point where it's either we pursue our true destiny in that direction, or we wither and die like Jerry Brown is demanding the people, but not the frackers, but the people of California do.
Well, there you have it. Just to echo what you said at the conclusion, Ben, this is the basis for the creation of a new presidency. And what Mr. LaRouche was emphatic about today, and what he was emphatic about with his discussion with the policy committee on Monday, was that nothing less than this standard is acceptable for the assembling of a new presidential team. This has been Mr. LaRouche's career as an individual for almost the last 40 years. Has been as a critical member, a critical part of shaping the presidency of the United States, all the way back to his campaign for president in '76. He said this has been the red thread uniting all of his activities in this country. His role in the Reagan administration, his role in influencing the Clinton administration, his role in battling against the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, the third Bush administration, Barack Obama, and now the role that he is playing as we speak in shaping the new presidency. And this includes doing battle against the enemies of this country, Jerry Brown, Barack Obama, Wall Street, the only individual who has qualified himself as of yet in that regard is Martin O'Malley, who has been unequivocal and public in his support for restoring Glass-Steagall. And this is not as an individual, but as the fulcrum around which we will create a presidential team, a presidential system which is held according to this standard, which you heard here tonight, this principle and nothing less. So we want to thank you for joining us here tonight. This has been a very important and very unique broadcast. It was very important for you to tune in, and it will be critical for you to circulate this as widely as you possibly can. So we have a lot of work to do, and we ask you please to stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com over the coming days. And thank you very much for tuning in. Stay tuned. Good night.